History often portrays alliances as ironclad, sealed with handshakes, speeches, and confident promises made across polished desks. But real wars are rarely decided in ceremonial rooms. They are shaped instead by quiet calculations, hidden charts, and numbers that refuse to bend to ideology. In the spring of 1941, Adolf Hitler believed he was orchestrating a global strategy that would keep the United States out of the war. In Tokyo, Japanese leaders were reaching a very different conclusion. What followed was not betrayal born of ambition, but desperation born of arithmetic. This is the story of how oil, not ideology, not honor, not alliance, drove Japan toward Pearl Harbor, and why Hitler never saw it coming. Berlin, April 4, 1941, 3:15 in the afternoon. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler leans forward over his heavy mahogany desk, locking eyes with Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka. His promise is bold, almost reckless. If Japan strikes Singapore, Germany, Hitler vows, will immediately move against the United States. The following day, Joachim von Ribbentrop reinforces the message with urgency. Attack Singapore first, declare war on Britain afterward. On paper, the axis appears perfectly synchronized. But nearly 5,400 miles away in Tokyo, behind layers of guards and concrete walls inside Imperial General Headquarters, Japanese naval officers are studying documents that have nothing to do with Singapore. Spread across their desks are fuel consumption tables, oil reserve forecasts, and intelligence reports tracking American tankers across the Pacific. They are preparing for a war Hitler will not learn about until it is already underway. The Berlin meeting ends with handshakes and rehearsed assurances of unity. Matsuoka bows politely, agrees to deliver Hitler's strategic vision to Tokyo, and boards his train eastward. His aides notice his distant expression, preoccupied, even uneasy. What they do not know is that Matsuoka has already received encrypted cables from Tokyo explaining Japan's true predicament. And it has nothing to do with British Malaya. Beneath the Imperial Palace, in war rooms insulated from the outside world, Japan's real crisis is unfolding on entirely different maps. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands before a massive chart of the Pacific Ocean. His gaze does not linger on Singapore. It is fixed instead on a small American harbor in the Hawaiian Islands, over 4,000 miles away. Pearl Harbor. The figures compiled by Yamamoto's staff tell a story Hitler could never fully grasp. Germany has oil fields in Romania. Japan has none. The Imperial Navy burns nearly 400 tons of fuel oil per hour during operations. At peacetime consumption rates, Japan's reserves might last 18 months. In war, perhaps 9. Worse still, 94% of Japan's oil is imported, and 80% of that comes from a single supplier, the United States. This creates a ruthless strategic chain. To secure oil, Japan must seize the Dutch East Indies. To reach the Indies, Japan must neutralize the Philippines. To move against the Philippines, American naval power in the Pacific must be destroyed. And the core of that power lies at Pearl Harbor, a name Hitler never mentions. Matsuoka returns to Tokyo on April 22, 1941, and dutifully delivers Hitler's message to the Supreme War Council. Generals and admirals listen with courtesy. Then they return to what truly matters. Planning continues for an operation Hitler will not learn about until December 7, when Japanese aircraft appear over Oahu and alter the course of the war in a single morning. Why would Japan defy its most powerful ally? Why reject a Singapore-first strategy that might have kept America neutral? Why risk everything by striking the world's greatest industrial power? The answer lies not in arrogance or imperial fantasy, but in a resource crisis so severe that Japan's leaders believed they had no alternative. To understand Pearl Harbor, one must first understand the trap Japan had built for itself, not with steel or gunpowder, but with oil contracts and shipping statistics. That trap began tightening in the 1930s. After the Washington Naval Treaty limited fleet sizes, Japan's navy faced a stark choice: accept permanent inferiority, or build fewer ships of overwhelming power. They chose power. They chose modernization. And in doing so they chose dependence. The Yamato-class battleships embodied this decision. At over 72,000 tons, they were the largest warships ever constructed. Their 18-inch guns could strike targets more than 25 miles away. Their armor was unmatched. They were symbols of national pride and logistical nightmares. Each consumed roughly 400 tons of fuel oil per day at cruising speed. In combat, that figure doubled. One Yamato burned more fuel in a week than Japan's entire fishing fleet consumed in a month. By 1939, naval fuel consumption had increased by more than 400% compared to a decade earlier. Domestic oil production barely moved. In March 1940, the Naval General Staff compiled these realities into a classified report. Its conclusions were brutal. Japan's military strength depended almost entirely on American oil. Captain Atsushi Oi, the intelligence officer responsible for petroleum analysis, later recalled presenting the report to senior admirals. The room was silent. No one disputed the numbers. No one offered solutions. The document was filed away, and fleet expansion continued as if fuel were limitless. The contradiction was obvious. Japan was preparing to challenge American power using resources America controlled. It was like building a fortress from your enemy's bricks and planning to turn it against him. For a time this seemed manageable. In 1937, Japan invaded China, expecting a quick campaign. Instead, the war dragged on. Newsreels of bombed cities and the massacre at Nanjing horrified American audiences. President Roosevelt, constrained by isolationist politics, could not declare war, but he could apply pressure. In 1939, the U.S. announced it would not renew its commercial treaty with Japan. Oil exports would continue only at Washington's discretion. Secretary of State Cordell Hull put it plainly in internal memos. Japan's war machine runs on American petroleum. We can influence behavior without firing a shot. Inside Japan, the Army and Navy drew opposite conclusions. The Army believed time remained to secure alternatives. The Navy, staring at fuel charts, knew time was measured in months. Yamamoto warned openly in November 1940, "Building strategy on the assumption that the enemy will supply your fuel is not strategy, it is fantasy." His warning was acknowledged and ignored. By early 1941, Japan's oil crisis was no longer theoretical. Reserves meant the difference between action and paralysis. If the United States imposed a full embargo, Japan would face only two choices: surrender its empire or go to war. That decision was forced in July 1941, not in Tokyo, but 6,800 miles away in Washington. Franklin D. Roosevelt faced his own dilemma. America opposed open war, yet already supported Britain in everything but name. Public opinion demanded neutrality. Roosevelt needed a weapon that did not explode. Japan's oil dependency provided it. Step by step, restrictions tightened. Aviation fuel, scrap iron, steel. Each move increased pressure without crossing the line into war. When Japan moved into southern Indochina in July 1941, Roosevelt acted decisively. Japanese assets were frozen. Oil licenses were halted. Britain and the Dutch followed suit. Within days, Japan lost access to nearly 90% of its imported oil. When the news reached Tokyo, silence filled the Supreme War Council chamber. Fuel calculations were updated. Timelines were laid bare. The war required to secure oil would itself burn the remaining oil faster than Japan could replace it. There would be no compromise. No middle path. The Navy understood what this meant. And so, as diplomats spoke of peace, Japan prepared for Pearl Harbor. On August 7, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto requested an emergency audience with Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa. The message he delivered left no room for interpretation. "We have fuel for roughly 1 year of combat, perhaps less," Yamamoto stated. "If war with the United States is unavoidable, it must begin now. If we delay in the hope of diplomacy, we will be left with a modern fleet that cannot leave harbor." August 1941 became a month ruled by merciless arithmetic. Each passing day drained Japan's fuel reserves. Each sunrise narrowed the window for decisive action. With every calculation, the choice between surrender and war sharpened into clarity. Franklin Roosevelt had accomplished what no American battleship could. He had placed a ticking clock on Japan's empire. The question was no longer whether Japan would act, but how. Would Tokyo follow Hitler's cautious Singapore First vision, or stake everything on something far more radical? Yamamoto, for his part, had already begun drafting the latter. And time was slipping away. Yamamoto stood nearly alone among Japan's senior commanders in understanding the scale of the storm ahead. Unlike most of his peers, he had lived in the United States. From 1919 to 1921, he studied at Harvard. Later, as naval attaché in Washington, he traveled widely, through Detroit's automobile plants, Texas oil fields, and Pittsburgh steel mills. Where other officers dismissed America as decadent and weak, Yamamoto saw industrial reality. "I have seen their factories," he later told his staff. "I have seen their oil fields. Anyone who has seen these things knows that war with America is madness." By August 1941, madness was all that remained. The oil embargo had erased every alternative. And if war could not be avoided, Yamamoto believed Japan's only chance was to strike first, hard, fast, and at the point that mattered most. Hitler's Singapore strategy was a distraction. Yes, Singapore was a British stronghold. Yes, its capture would humiliate the colonial powers. But it did nothing to solve Japan's core dilemma. The problem was geometric, not political. Japan needed the oil of the Dutch East Indies. To reach it, Japanese forces had to move through the Philippines, American territory. Once the Philippines were attacked, war with the United States was guaranteed. And once America entered the war, the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would sever Japan's supply lines within months. Yamamoto presented this logic in a classified briefing to the Naval General Staff on September 2, 1941. His conclusion was blunt. Southern operations were impossible while the American fleet remained intact at Pearl Harbor. The fleet had to be neutralized first. The plan he proposed bordered on the unthinkable. A carrier strike force would cross over 4,000 miles of open ocean in total radio silence. 6 carriers would launch coordinated attacks against American battleships at anchor. The strike would occur on a Sunday morning, when readiness was expected to be lowest. Surprise was everything. Anything less than near total success would be meaningless. Skepticism followed immediately. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue voiced the prevailing concern. An attack on the most heavily defended naval base in the Pacific, across waters Japan did not control, would become suicide if detected even a day early. Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi raised a deeper fear. Even if Pearl Harbor were destroyed, America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's by an order of magnitude. This does not win the war, he warned. At best, it delays defeat. Yamamoto did not disagree. Instead, he reframed the reality. A long war was never winnable, he replied. Our only hope has always been a short one, 6 months of victories so decisive that America chooses negotiation over endless sacrifice. Pearl Harbor is not about victory. It is about forcing a choice. The General Staff remained uneasy. Even Yamamoto's own Chief of Staff, Captain Kamito Kurashima, privately believed the assumptions were flawed. A surprise attack would not break American will, it would ignite it. Revenge, not negotiation, would follow. Through September and October, objections piled up. Perfect weather was required across thousands of miles. American carriers, the fleet's true striking power, had to be in port. Radar stations could not detect the approach. Diplomatic talks had to continue normally, masking all intent. One failure would doom the mission. Taken together, the odds appeared vanishingly small. But by late October, probability no longer mattered. Fuel reserves were falling by over 12,000 barrels per day. Naval planners concluded that waiting until spring 1942 would leave insufficient fuel for any major operation. Time had expired. On October 18, Yamamoto delivered an unprecedented ultimatum. In a written memorandum to Navy Minister Oikawa, he stated that if the Pearl Harbor operation were cancelled, he would resign command of the combined fleet. He would not lead forces into a war he believed unwinnable under alternative strategies. The threat carried enormous weight. Yamamoto was Japan's most respected naval strategist. His resignation would signal internal collapse, and no alternative plan solved the oil dilemma he had identified. On November 3, the Naval General Staff approved Operation Z. The decision carried no confidence, only resignation. Every other option had been exhausted. Hitler was never informed. German diplomats in Tokyo received routine updates about southern operations but nothing about Hawaii. Ribbentrop's continued urging to strike Singapore went unanswered. The Axis alliance, loud in propaganda, proved hollow in practice. By mid-November, the carrier strike force assembled in secrecy at Hidokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, chosen to lead despite deep personal doubts, prepared for a mission he believed had perhaps a 40% chance at best. In Washington, the picture seemed reassuringly logical. Intelligence analysts tracked Japanese troop movements toward Southeast Asia. Convoys gathered near Indochina. Naval forces concentrated around Formosa. Assessments concluded that hostilities were imminent, but aimed south. Pearl Harbor was never listed. The assumption appeared sound. Hawaii lay over 4,000 miles away across open ocean. Detection seemed inevitable. Japan's economy was 1/10 the size of America's. Its steel production a fraction. The idea that Japan could launch simultaneous operations against Malaya, the Philippines, and Hawaii defied American logic. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, received no intelligence suggesting Hawaii was a target. When concerns were raised, his response mirrored Washington's thinking. Japan would strike where resources lay, the Indies, not Hawaii. One man tried to warn otherwise. Ambassador Joseph Grew, stationed in Tokyo since 1932, understood Japan better than any American diplomat. In January 1941, he reported rumors of a possible surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The warning was politely acknowledged and dismissed as impractical. Grew repeated his concerns throughout the year. Each time they were filed away. Analysts fell victim to mirror imaging, assuming the enemy thought as they did. American doctrine favored sustainability and gradual escalation. Risking an entire carrier fleet on a single gamble seemed unthinkable. Therefore it was assumed Japan would think the same way. They did not. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized concentration, aggression, and decisive first strikes. While American carriers escorted battleships, Japanese carriers trained to destroy fleets. The gap was immense and unnoticed. On November 27, a final warning reached Pacific commanders. War was imminent. Expected targets were listed. Hawaii was not among them. At Pearl Harbor, peacetime routines remained. Aircraft were parked wingtip to prevent sabotage. Battleships lay clustered along Battleship Row. Anti-aircraft ammunition stayed locked away. At 7:02 a.m. on December 7, radar operators at Opana Point detected a massive formation approaching from the north. The report reached Fort Shafter. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler assumed it was an expected flight of American bombers. "Don't worry about it," he said. It was the first wave, 183 Japanese aircraft. The strike force had departed Hido-Kapu Bay on November 26 under strict orders. Absolute radio silence, avoid shipping lanes, turn back if detected before December 6. 6 carriers carried over 400 aircraft across the Pacific without a single transmission. On December 2, Tokyo sent the coded order. Climb Mount Nitaka. By December 6, the fleet lay 275 miles north of Oahu. Final preparations began. Torpedoes were modified for shallow water. Bomb loads confirmed. Pilots briefed. The plan Hitler never knew was seconds from execution. December 7, 1941 did not begin with panic. It began with routine. As dawn broke over the Pacific, Pearl Harbor rested in quiet confidence. Battleships lay calmly along Ford Island. Sailors prepared for breakfast. No alarms sounded. No one believed Japan could strike this far, this fast. Far to the north, Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind. Deck crews worked in silence as planes lifted into the sky one by one. The first wave, 183 aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs, formed up and headed south. The war everyone expected to erupt in Southeast Asia was about to begin in Hawaii instead. At 7:55 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fukuda sent the signal confirming total surprise. Tora, Tora, Tora. Below him, Pearl Harbor remained unaware it had minutes of peace left. The first bombs fell on American airfields at 7:57. Aircraft parked tightly together were destroyed before they could move. Seconds later, torpedo bombers skimmed low across the harbor, releasing weapons modified for shallow water. The USS Oklahoma was struck repeatedly and capsized within minutes. The West Virginia settled into the harbor floor. The California began a slow, fatal sinking. At 8:10 a.m. devastating explosion tore through the USS Arizona. An armor-piercing bomb reached her forward magazine, erupting in a blast visible for miles. In moments the ship was destroyed. Over 1,000 men died instantly. By the time the second wave arrived, Pearl Harbor was chaos, burning ships, wrecked airfields, smoke filling the sky. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway, was bombed as she tried to escape. Her captain deliberately ran her aground to avoid blocking the harbor. By mid-morning the attack was over. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. 8 battleships were sunk or crippled. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. From a tactical perspective, it was a stunning success. Yet the strike carried fatal flaws. Japan did not destroy the fuel storage tanks that kept the Pacific Fleet alive. Repair facilities remained intact. Most importantly, the American aircraft carriers were not in harbor. They had survived. Then came the mistake no admiral could undo. Japan's declaration of war arrived in Washington after the attack had already begun. America had been struck without warning, during negotiations on a Sunday morning. The political impact was immediate. On December 8, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress. His speech lasted minutes. The response lasted years. Congress declared war almost unanimously. Isolationism vanished overnight. The attack meant to force negotiation instead unified the nation for total war. Japan's leaders had hoped for 6 months of freedom. They got exactly that. By mid-1942, the Japanese empire stretched across the Pacific. Singapore fell. The Philippines collapsed. The Dutch East Indies oil fields, Japan's true objective, were captured. For a moment, it seemed the gamble had worked. But American submarines began sinking the tankers that carried that oil. The carriers that escaped Pearl Harbor struck back. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed in a single day, 3 of them veterans of December 7th. The elite pilots Japan could not replace died with them. America replaced its losses effortlessly. Shipyards launched carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Pilot schools produced thousands of aviators while Japan rationed fuel so tightly that training flights were cut to hours instead of months. By 1944, Japan's oil imports fell below the levels that had triggered the war in the first place. Warships sat idle not from fear but from emptiness. The crisis Japan had tried to escape now strangled the empire completely. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece and a strategic disaster. The attack awakened an industrial power that would not negotiate, would not tire, and would not stop. Japan did not attack because it had a winning plan. It attacked because it had run out of time. The battle was won in a morning. The war was lost the moment it began.